Hello everyone, welcome back to the Union Pacific Railroad Evanston subdivision in HO Scale. My name is Darrell Cruz, owner and builder of the layout, and your host for a special part 2 of the Evanston Yard Crew Instructional Series. This is part 2. Previously in part 1, we saw the yard crew get cars ready for the MRONP, which has some cars to swap out, cars to drop off, and cars to pick up. So last week the yard crew got those cars ready to go that are going to be picked up by the train. In this video, part 2, we're going to see the MRONP actually arrive, and we're going to put the locomotives in the engine facilities and then do some more work in swapping out the cars, but also work on getting a train ready for departure from the yard. Now this train that's coming in from Salt Lake City, this is from the Roper Yard, that's the RO in the MRONP. So it started out at the Roper Yard in Salt Lake City, and it has a quick stop here in Evanston, and then it will continue on to North Platte. And here you can see it going from the main line and taking the crossover onto the Evanston Yard track. And as you can see, there is a little bit of a decline. The main line has much more of a roadbed profile, so the tracks are a little bit higher, and the trains then come down into the yard, and it's coming into track 1, which is the arrival departure track. And this is an arrival train, obviously, and so it's coming in on track 1. This is a 7-track yard, so you have the 2 mainline tracks, as you can see on the right, and then tracks 1 through 7 for the yard. Track 1 is arrival departure track. 2 through 6 are classification tracks, and the 7th track is held for a bypass, which we'll see this road crew do for the MRONP. So we have a couple of units here, a Tier 4 GEVO and an SD75 from PRLX, and it's going to pull into the arrival track. And it's going to continue to pull up. The main thing that the train needs to make sure that it does is clear the crossover that it used to enter the yard. And so even if it has to go past this yard throat, the train would need to continue on. So as you can see, this is moving a little bit further. The train is going into the end of the yard throat, but it definitely needs to clear the crossover so that the main line is no longer clogged, and then it can go ahead and couple and head to the engine facilities. Now there are times when trains that are arriving and sometimes departing are longer than the arrival departure track, which is the case here. As you can see, the engines were past the end of the arrival track. As we go to the other end of the yard, you can see that the train actually goes past the throat on this side also. Does not mean that the train is too long for the yard to handle. It just means that it has to kind of be done in a certain way. So even though it's fouling the west end of the yard, we're going to go ahead and uncouple here at this point so that the locomotives can clear their train and head into the bypass track. Now the signal there that's flashing red, that's the crossover to go back onto the main line at the east end of the yard. The top one was flashing, which means it was set to go straight through. Now there is a yard switcher there, so that's why it was flashing red. It's almost always flashing red So they're expected to go restricted speed through that particular control point, I should say. But it does have room to clear the turnouts and then come down the ladder and go into the bypass track. Now again, as it gets to the other end of the yard, these two locomotives are heading to the engine facilities. So it has to use the bypass track, and it's important that the yard crew keeps that track open. So when it has an arriving train, the locomotives can get past anything that's taking place in the yard, get past the cars and go to the other end of the yard and head to the engine facilities, or vice versa if it's coming from the engine facilities to the head end of the train. That's definitely the case for the eastward trains. If you have a westward train, then it's not such an issue, since the locomotives would be at the other end of the yard. All right, now that the road crew is clear of the train, the yard switcher will go ahead and connect to the train. And this is how the yard is able to handle trains that are a little bit longer than they should be. As you remember, this train does extend past the yard throat on the other end, but we're going to go ahead and connect to the train and then pull forward, which will clear the end of the train on the other end of the yard throat at the other end of the yard. So we're connected to it, and we're going to go ahead and pull forward. Now the cars that are going to be dropped off here for this train are at the head end of the train, so we'll be no problem to go ahead and uncouple these and then put them in the yard, and then we have the cars ready to go that we put together in part one, and we'll go ahead and put them back onto the train. Now the locomotives will be at the engine facilities for a bit. They will either need to be refueled, and there may be a yard crew change. Not a yard crew change, but there may be a crew change. And they may even swap out locomotives and use a brand new set of locomotives for the rest of the journey. Now, they could also be times where the road crew would actually do the swapping out. If there's a rush for them to get out of here, they might go ahead and just swap out the cars themselves. But in this case, they do need to stop at the engine facilities for a crew change and any refueling that might need to be done. As they continue their trip towards North Platte. As you can see, this end of the yard is now clear since we pulled the train forward, and the road crew is able to head into the engine facilities. Now, one thing that the road crew, of course, needs to do when it gets to the yard is turn off its ditch lights, and then it also has lights on the trailing locomotive. So it is required to turn on the headlight of the trailing locomotive, and then they usually will also then put the lights on dim. So both the units have their headlights on, no ditch lights, and the lights are on dim. And of course then, before it gets back onto the main line, the ditch lights will be put back on, trailing headlight turned off, and the dim will be turned off as well. All right, it's clear of the points there, so we'll go ahead and throw the turnout. And then we'll pull back into the fueling station. Now there is not a active locomotive facility at Evanston on the prototype. In fact, the yard in Evanston on the prototype is really not used very much at all. When we were there visiting in June of 21, there was hardly any cars in the yard, no activity whatsoever. A couple of really old locomotives, switching locomotives were there, so it wasn't active at all. So what we're doing on this layout is we're changing things between Green River and Evanston. On the prototype, Evanston is pretty much not used at all as a yard, and Green River is the major yard where there is quite a bit of activity. Trains originating and terminating from the yard, and there's engine facilities there and so on. So on the layout, we're kind of switching things up to where the Union Pacific decided to make Evanston the major yard, and Green River was the yard that turned out to be limited in use. So making that little change just to make the layout a little bit more interesting for operations. All right, so there will be, right here at this location, there will be a fueling station. Here you can see the kit I'm going to use for that. Then there is an engine house there from Walthers. So this will be some fueling, a fueling station, and also water and sand. And then there will also be the shops there. So there could be cases where the train just stops for a very limited time and the road crew does the swapping out themselves. And then there might be times when the locomotives are swapped out, where you have a whole new set of locomotives used. And there might be times where it just stops there for refueling and general light maintenance. And then they use the same locomotives again, which we're going to be doing in this particular video. All right, so we've gone ahead and uncoupled the cars that need to be set out here. And we're going to go ahead and put them into the yard tracks. Now, there were some questions and comments about the use of yard tracks. And so we are right now setting these cars in the yard tracks. And here you can kind of see where I'm going to be putting them. So the cars to be picked up are in the MRONP on the right-hand side at the very bottom. And then there's 4 sections that are set up as being yard tracks. So I'm going to set it up into those, in one of those 4 sections. There'll be one of the 2 on this side. But anyway, the yard tracks, we're going to be setting these in the yard tracks, and there's not really going to be right now, today, not any actual destination specified for these cars as far as where they're going next. And there's some people who had comments that that's not prototypical, and that, you know, these should be set in particular locations that's their destination. However, with only 7 tracks, it's, you know, very limited, and there just aren't enough tracks in the yard to be able to have all the different destinations. So what I'm doing here is using tracks which I call yard tracks, which are basically a track or sections that will represent multiple locations. And then the cars will be pulled out in next days or in a few days, whenever it comes up, whether cars will be pulled to go to their next destination. So it is kind of a, you know, it may not be, quote, prototypical, although I bet there probably is a place that, you know, some yard somewhere that do things, you know, that way. But if I had, you know, 10 tracks or 12 tracks here, then I would be able to spot all of each one of these 6 cars and a specific track for where it goes next. But right now, well, actually, for this layout, don't expect to expand the yard in any time in the future. So this is pretty much how we're doing it. The yard tracks will represent multiple destinations, and then the other tracks do have specific destinations and specific trains that we are going to be setting cars for. And that would be coming up in not this part, but in part 3. We'll be doing some classification where we'll be setting cars on 2 tracks, and where the tracks are specific locations or specific trains that these cars are going to be going on in the days to come. All right, so the yard crew has went ahead and uncoupled the cars that are to be dropped off here. Now, we could go ahead and add on the cars right away, but it could be some time before the road crew will be able to get back and with the new crew and refueled locomotives. So while we're waiting, we're going to leave the cars unattached, and we're going to go ahead and look at our train build that we have coming up, which is LDR 07, which is heading towards West Vaco. This train has already been put together and is in a track, and it's ready to go except for one thing. So as you can see there's a 07NX. It's abbreviation for LDR 07. NX stands for next day, which is actually going to be today. So it's all set to go, except it needs to have the cars that it's to be dropping off at West Vaco. It needs to have those cars put on the head end of the train. So that's what we're going to be doing now. This is a yard train build for LDR 07. The cars have already been assembled and are in place on looks like track 2, and we are going to pull them all out, and we're going to look for the cars that are to be dropped off at West Vaco, and we're going to make sure that they are at the head end of the train. So the previous day's crew has classified previous arriving trains and has put the cars in this track so that the train will be ready to go, but it still, before it departs, it still needs to have now the cars destined for West Vaco to be put at the head end. So that's what we're going to do. So 3 of the cars are right here together. If you look, you can see the list of cars that are going to be set out. So you have the GATX, CMO, UP. So the CMO, UP, and CP are right there together. There's 3 of them right together. The 3 just went by. Then there's a couple of tank cars. I think that black one is one of them right there. I think that's 92033. And there's another tank car. So basically, rather than having to use the helicopter drone and look and search them, we just pull the train out, and as we do so, we try to identify cars that are going to be going on this that are going to be dropped off. Here's the GATX covered hopper that goes also, and I think that's the tank car that we need. And so that's all of them, I think. Oh, well, we also need one more. It's the I think it's this one right here. That's the UP 111230. All right, so we're going to go ahead and take each of these cars and set them out. And then we're going to make sure that they're at the head end of the train. So when this train heads out, it can easily drop them off at Westvaco. Now that signal should not be flashing red. The reason it is flashing red right now is because I still have a lot of cars that need resistor wheels. So as you watch it, every once in a while it'll go off. But there you go, it stopped flashing. One of those cars does have resistor wheel sets. I probably have about half of them done. All right, so there's the UP 111230. And I believe the next one we'll put in here is the PRTX tank car 137. A lot of people, or not a lot, but a few people have mentioned about how they have worked at yards. There's been maybe 2 or 3 people that have commented that they actually have worked or are working in yards, and they don't do their yard the way that I'm doing it. And then, of course, we got the long description about how they do it, which is interesting to see how different yards do things. However, I think it's important to remember that there's hundreds of yards across the country, and I'm pretty sure that each yard or different yards do things differently, and that they don't all do the yards exactly the same. So while I appreciate the information, hope people understand that just because that's not how it's done at your particular yard does not mean that that's not how it's done at other yards. And I was able to put this operating scheme together with someone who did work at Proviso Yard on the Geneva sub. He helped me with my yard on the Geneva sub, and we're using the same type of operations on this one. So I feel pretty confident that this is a prototypical way of operating. Doesn't mean that there might be some fine-tuning that takes place, and that's why it's always helpful to hear what other places do. All right, so now we're going to drop off the GATX. So we have 2 of the covered hoppers and 1 tank car. And we still have another tank car and 3 more covered hoppers yet to set out. Oh, there's a train meet over here I wanted to catch real quick. That's one thing that's kind of nice about running trains when I'm just doing it by myself. I always have trains running while I'm doing this, so it's always kind of nice to be involved in the switching operations, and then it's kind of cool to kind of take a break and watch the action on the layout, especially when they go by on the same level. Well, here in this case it was on the upper level. All right, back to work. Notice we are keeping the same track location for this train. And still, we're putting all the cars back into track 2. So we don't need to change the location on the chart. I think we need to go back to that tank car, the black tank car. So we have this tank car here yet, the UTLX 920033. Need to get it set out. Not sure why I'm going so far here. I think I kind of lost track of what I was doing here. So it's being coupled off the screen. I find tank car couplers are the hardest to uncouple. They have those shelf type couplers. They do not want to come uncoupled. Alright, so we have this one cement car here yet that's not going to be going to West Vaco, so we're going to put that back into track 2. And then we're fortunate that we have 3 that are right in a row. The CP Canadian Pacific 650026. And then there's a CMO, which is Union Pacific 22508. And then the third one is the UP 99895, and that's all the cars that we need at the head end of the train. 5 covered hoppers and 2 tank cars. We do have this cement car here that we need to go ahead and put back into track 2, and then we'll pull these 7 cars and place them in track 2, and we'll have our train back together and ready to go. And maybe changing this train to a different train, mainly because the Roper Yard is not very far from here. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that the train would depart the Roper Yard and then make a stop right away at Evanston. But it's not inconceivable either. Now that's the train that's in track 1. We're right now working on a local LDR 07. But the train that we swapped out cars on, or we are going to be swapping out cars, may change it to a different one, maybe one that originates in California somewhere. Maybe Riverside, and then it would make more sense to stop at Evanston. In any event, these are the 7 cars that are going to be dropped off at Westvaco. So we're going to go ahead and put it at the head end of this LDR 07, and then it'll be ready to go. And we actually will have this train ready for motive power, and then it can depart. One of the key things about an efficient running yard is being able to get trains out of the yard as efficiently as possible. And then you have empty tracks ready for trains that are going to be coming in. If you don't get the trains out and you have a train that wants to come in, it blocks up fouls up the main line and kind of backs everything up. So we right now will have this train ready to go so we can get motive power. Once we get these cars in here, we can go ahead and get motive power attached to this train and ready to depart. Or we can, if we don't want to do that right away, if we have time, which we are going to actually do today, before we get the LDR 07 out, we're going to go ahead and add the cars that need to be added to M, R, O, and P, and we'll go ahead and have that one head back out again, possibly. But and by the time this video is done, we'll have 2 trains that are ready to get motive power and depart, and they'll both be ready to go eastward. Track 3 contains a train, LUJ 63, which is a westward train. And actually, while we're doing this, the other yard crew would be working the other end of the yard, and we'll be doing the same thing, getting the cars that are going to be dropped off at Wholesome Cement, which is in the other direction. But cars that are going to Wholesome Cement, it would be getting those cars at the head end of that train. So we should be able to have 3 trains, all 3 trains ready to go. And definitely will need to get them out since we got 3 trains, or a couple trains at least, still ready to come in. So now we're going to get the cars that we assembled in part 1 of this video series. And we're going to go ahead and grab those and put them onto the train in track 1, the MRONP. And then we'll get it ready to go out of the yard. We put those cars in track 6, which is where we're headed. All right, we're going to go ahead and put these at the head end of this train. Now, we're not going to go ahead and push them all the way in. We're going to leave them pretty much as is so that the other end of the yard stays clear to allow the road crew to come up and come back to this end of the train and be ready to take off. This brings us to the end of part 2. Part 3 will be the departure of this MNROP. Departure of it from the yard, and then also an incoming local into the yard. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.